The week my husband died, I learned that grief isn't one thing. It doesn't arrive clean and singular. The way people describe it, a wave, a fog, a weight on your chest. It arrives in layers. There's the grief of losing the person. Then there's the grief of losing the life you thought you had. And then there's a third kind. The worst kind. The grief that comes when you realize the people standing beside you at the graveside are not who you thought they were. My name is Renata. I'm 61 years old. And this is the story of the 17 years I spent loving a man named Paul Gallagher, and what happened when he died and left me alone with his sons. Please subscribe to the channel to see what happens next. Paul and I met when I was 44. I'd had a quiet career before him, managing a regional property firm in Portland, Oregon, and I was good at it. I wasn't looking for anyone when we met at a mutual friend's dinner party in the fall. He was 52, recently divorced, with 2 grown sons and the kind of stillness about him that made you feel safe just being in the same room. We were married 14 months later. His sons, Garrett, who was 29 at the time, and Dominic, 26, were polite at the wedding. That's the honest word for it. Not warm, not welcoming, polite. They shook my hand, thanked me for the meal, and looked at me the way people look at a piece of furniture they didn't choose but aren't going to argue about. Not yet. I told myself it was normal. I told myself these things took time. And they did. 17 years. As it turned out, 17 years. And we never quite got to warm. I gave up my position at the property firm 2 years into the marriage. Paul's business, a regional logistics company headquartered in Portland, with a secondary office in Bend, had grown beyond his ability to manage alone. And I had the background to help. It wasn't a sacrifice I resented. I loved the work. I loved being useful to him. And I believed, in the uncomplicated way you believe things when you're happy, that we were building something together. We were, just not in the way I understood at the time. Paul was diagnosed with a degenerative neurological condition in the spring of his 65th year. It moved slowly at first: fatigue, occasional confusion, a tremor in his right hand that he tried to hide from me for months before I noticed. By the time he admitted what was happening, we'd already lost most of a year to careful silence and the particular loneliness of 2 people protecting each other from the same fear. The last 18 months of his life, I was his primary caregiver. I drove him to appointments, managed his medications, handled his correspondence, and sat with him through the long, difficult nights when pain kept him awake and silence was the only comfort either of us had to offer. Garrett flew in from Seattle twice during that period. Dominic, who lived 40 minutes away in Beaverton, visited on holidays. I am not saying this to be unkind. I am saying it because it is true. And because the truth matters when I get to the part of this story where they tell me they loved their father more than I did. Paul died on a Thursday in November. Just after 6 in the morning. I was holding his hand. The light was coming through the curtains in that particular November way, thin and gray and honest, and I remember thinking that the silence after was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. Garrett arrived that afternoon. Dominic was there by evening. They brought a woman I'd never met, a lawyer named Clifford Hennessy, who worked at a firm Garrett had apparently been consulting with for some time. I found that out later. For the first 2 days, everything was careful and subdued. Grief is good camouflage for cruelty. People are on their best behavior when there's a casket in the room. It's after the funeral, when the flowers start to brown and the casseroles run out, that you find out who people really are. The morning after the burial, Garrett asked to meet with me in Paul's study. He sat in Paul's chair. I noticed that immediately. Not the chair across from the desk. Not the couch along the wall. But Paul's chair, behind Paul's desk, with Paul's reading lamp casting light across his face. He looked like a man who had been waiting a long time to sit in that chair. Dominic stood near the window, his arms crossed, his expression carrying that particular blend of discomfort and compliance that had always defined him around his older brother. "Renata," Garrett said, "we need to talk about the estate." I sat down across from him. "All right." He opened a leather portfolio and slid a document across the desk toward me. I recognized the format immediately. A will. Not ours. I mean, not the one Paul had shown me 3 years ago. The one we'd gone through together in this same room with Martin Cho, our estate attorney. The one that had left everything jointly to me. This one was different. Older. The date at the top was 7 years back. Dad updated his estate documents after reviewing his long-term wishes. Garrett said. His voice had the practiced calm of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation. The house here in Lake Oswego. That transfers to Dominic and myself jointly. The property in Bend as well. The business interests will be held in a trust we'll administer together. I kept my eyes on the document. And me? Dominic spoke then, quickly, as though he'd been waiting for a specific cue. There's a life insurance policy. $250,000. And naturally, we want you to take your time. 60 days, Garrett said, to make alternate living arrangements. We think that's more than generous, given the circumstances. I looked at the document again. I looked at the date. I looked at Garrett's hands on Paul's desk, on Paul's blotter, on the pen Paul had used every morning to write in the journal he kept for 30 years. There are also some outstanding medical invoices from the later stages of Dad's care. Garrett continued. The insurance didn't cover everything. The outstanding balance is approximately $160,000. As his spouse, you'd have shared liability for those decisions. $160,000. $250,000 in life insurance. 60 days. I need some time to think, I said. Of course, Garrett said, and he smiled, and it was a kind smile. The kind of smile that knows it has already won. What I didn't tell them, what I didn't tell anyone, was that something had happened 3 weeks before Paul died. He'd been having a particularly clear day. One of those unexpected windows that neurological illness sometimes opens, where the fog lifts for a few hours and the person you love is entirely themselves again. We'd talked for a long time that afternoon. About the early years of our marriage. About the trip we'd taken to coastal Maine on our 5th anniversary. About the garden we'd planned but never planted. Near the end of the conversation, he'd asked me to bring him the small cedar box he kept on the top shelf of the closet. I'd retrieved it without asking why. He held it for a long time without opening it. There are things I should have told you sooner, he said finally. Paul. Let me finish. He looked at me steadily. I've known for about a year what Garrett and Dominic have been planning. I want you to understand that what you're going to go through after I'm gone is not what I intended. But I also need you to trust that it's not going to end the way they expect. He pressed the cedar box into my hands. Don't open this until after the estate meeting. After they've shown you the will. Not before. Promise me. I promised. I kept the box in the bottom of my closet for 2 weeks while grief and funeral arrangements and Garrett's careful maneuvering consumed every available hour. I kept my promise even when it felt like the hardest thing I'd ever done. The morning after the meeting in Paul's study, I sat alone in our bedroom, the cedar box in my lap, and I finally opened it. Inside was an envelope, a small brass key, and a folded piece of paper with a name and phone number written in Paul's handwriting. Eleanor Voss, Voss and Carmichael, Portland. Call her first, then the key, in that order. The envelope was sealed with Paul's initials pressed into blue wax. I set it aside and called Eleanor Voss. She answered on the second ring. Mrs. Gallagher, she said, before I could introduce myself. I've been expecting your call. I'm very sorry for your loss. Can you come in today? Eleanor Voss's office was on the 14th floor of a building in the Pearl District, with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the Willamette River. She was in her early 50s, elegant without being intimidating, with the particular manner of someone who had delivered difficult truths so many times she'd learned to do it gently. She shook my hand, gestured to a chair, and without preamble opened a file on her desk. Your husband retained my firm approximately 14 months ago, she said, initially for a routine estate review. But as our work progressed, the scope expanded considerably. She paused. Mrs. Gallagher, I need to ask, did your husband ever discuss with you the nature of his son's financial situations? Not in detail. She nodded, as though she'd expected this. We conducted a thorough financial investigation at your husband's request. What we found was significant. She placed a document in front of me. It was a summary report from a licensed investigator. 32 pages, with both Garrett's and Dominic's names on the cover. Garrett had a gambling problem. Not a casual one, a serious, structural one. The kind that had been quietly accumulating debt for years. At the time of Paul's death, he owed $287 to various creditors, several of them connected to private lending operations with aggressive collection practices. He had been counting on his inheritance to make all of that disappear. Dominic's situation was different and, in some ways, worse. He ran a small financial advisory practice in Beaverton. Over the preceding 4 years, he had been diverting funds from client accounts, elderly clients. Primarily, people who trusted him with their retirement savings. The total amount misappropriated was $340. He had been careful enough that no one had reported him yet. But a forensic accounting review could unravel it in days. Both men were financially desperate. Both men had been waiting for their father's death to solve their problems. I sat with the document for a long time without speaking. There's more, Eleanor said carefully. The will Garrett showed you. The one dated 7 years ago. That document was obtained through Martin Cho's office. Mr. Cho retired 18 months ago and transferred his files to a junior associate. We believe Garrett accessed those files through a contact at the firm and retrieved an outdated version of the will before the current documents could be identified. So there's a newer will? Yes, executed 11 months ago, after Paul retained our firm. The current will leaves the entirety of the estate to you, with discretionary trusts for Garrett and Dominic that disperse modest annual amounts but cannot be liquidated. I exhaled slowly. But that's not the part you need to understand first, Eleanor continued. She reached into the file and withdrew a second document, a set of mortgage records. 14 months ago, your husband took out a first mortgage on the Lake Oswego property. $600,000. 8 months ago, a second mortgage on the Bend property. $420,000. I stared at the numbers. The money from those mortgages was moved into a protected account under a holding company your husband established. You are the sole authorized signatory. She slid a bank statement across the desk. The balance read $1.04 million. The properties Garrett and Dominic expect to inherit are currently worth approximately $1.3 million combined. The mortgages against them total over $1 million, after accounting for transaction costs and early payment penalties. Inheriting those properties would leave them with a net of less than $200,000, which, given their existing debts, is effectively nothing. I thought about Garrett sitting in Paul's chair, about the rehearsed patience in his voice, about the $250,000 in insurance he'd offered me like it was a gift. Paul knew this would happen. I said, it wasn't a question. Eleanor nodded. He spent the last year of his life making sure of it. There was one more item in the file. A second life insurance policy. One Garrett and Dominic hadn't mentioned because they didn't know it existed. Face value. $400,000. Beneficiary. Me. Between the insurance policies, the holding account, and the protected investments Paul had quietly been building for years, I was looking at over $1.7 million. Alone. Eleanor folded her hands on the desk. Mrs. Gallagher, your husband was very specific in his instructions to me. He wanted you to have complete information before making any decisions. And he wanted you to know that whatever you choose to do with that information, whether you pursue criminal charges against Dominic, whether you grant Garrett and Dominic any portion of the estate, whether you walk away entirely, the choice is yours. He trusted your judgment. He said to tell you that directly. He trusted your judgment. I sat in that chair for a long time after Eleanor finished talking, watching the river move below the window. Garrett called that evening. His voice carried the particular smooth efficiency of a man who believed he was managing a situation that was already resolved. Renata, I wanted to check in. I know the last few days have been a lot. Dominic and I are hoping we can finalize the transfer paperwork by end of week. We've asked our attorney to coordinate with whoever you're working with. Their attorney. Of course. That's thoughtful, Garrett, I said. Actually, I've been going through some of your father's personal files. There are some documents I don't quite understand, bank statements for accounts I wasn't aware of. Some property records that seem unusual. I thought I'd have an attorney review them before signing anything. The silence lasted 3 full seconds. What kind of bank statements? He said. His voice had changed, still controlled, but with something tighter underneath it. I'm not sure. There's also a key I found in his things. I haven't figured out what it opens yet. Another pause. Renata, Dad's financial records can be complicated. Dominic and I would be happy to review whatever you found. Make sure nothing's been misunderstood. That's very kind, but I think I'll start with an attorney. For my own peace of mind. You understand? Of course, he said, and this time the smile in his voice was gone. I met with their attorney 2 days later. His name was Henderson, a compact man in his mid-50s who wore his confidence like a second suit. He had clearly been told this would be a brief meeting, a grieving widow ratifying the paperwork. A few signatures, and done. Eleanor Voss sat beside me. I watched Henderson's expression shift, in real time, as he registered who she was. The meeting took 40 minutes. By the end of it, Garrett had aged visibly. Dominic sat very still, the way people sit when they're trying not to show that something has just broken inside them. Eleanor walked them through the real will, the mortgage records, the investigation findings, and the specific provisions Paul had made. She was precise and entirely without drama. She spoke the way people speak when they are simply describing what is true. When she finished, the room was quiet. The estate as currently structured, Eleanor said, transfers the Lake Oswego and Bend properties to Garrett and Dominic as Paul directed, in the older will they presented. However, the mortgages Paul placed against those properties transfer with them, based on current market valuations. The net equity is approximately $180, split between 2 properties in 2 different jurisdictions. Given the liens, no financial institution will refinance either property at current rates. You can't do this, Garrett said. His voice was flat. Your stepmother is choosing to honor the terms of the will you presented her. Eleanor said pleasantly, she's giving you exactly what you asked for. I looked at Garrett across the table, at the man who had sat in Paul's chair. Who had offered me 60 days and $250,000 as though it were charity. I want you to understand something, I said. Your father knew what you were planning for a long time. He wasn't confused. He wasn't diminished. He was watching, and thinking, and making sure that what you received was proportionate to what you were willing to give. Dominic looked up at me then. For a moment, something crossed his face that might have been genuine. He knew about the accounts? He asked quietly. The client accounts? Yes. He looked down again. He didn't say anything else. As for the client funds, Eleanor said, we have a complete forensic accounting prepared for the Oregon Financial Regulatory Board. Whether that report is filed is entirely Renata's decision. She's asked me to convey that she's willing to hold that in abeyance, for now, if both of you agree to a full restitution plan for the affected clients. That's blackmail, Henderson said. It's a choice, Eleanor replied. One Mr. Gallagher could have made himself and chose not to, because he wanted his wife to have that leverage. Not him. The offer stands for 30 days. They signed. Not graciously, not without Henderson making several objections that Eleanor dispatched with quiet efficiency. But they signed. Garrett accepted the properties with the mortgages. Dominic agreed to a structured restitution plan for his former clients that would take 5 years to complete. In exchange, I agreed to hold the regulatory filing. As I stood in the parking garage afterward, Eleanor beside me, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph. Exactly. Not relief. Something quieter than either of those things. Paul told me something in our last meeting, Eleanor said as we walked to our cars. He said he spent most of his life trying to give people the benefit of the doubt. He said it was the right way to live, and he didn't regret it. But he also said that there's a difference between forgiving someone and letting them continue. I thought about that for a long time on the drive home. I sold the house in Lake Oswego 6 months later. It was full of good memories. But it was also full of the echoes of the last 18 months. And I needed space that was only mine. I bought a small craftsman house on the coast near Cannon Beach. White clapboard, a covered porch that faced the water, a garden that the previous owners had started but abandoned. I spent the first spring bringing it back, foxglove and lavender. Climbing roses along the fence. A vegetable bed along the south wall where the light was best. The house cost me considerably less than I could afford. And the garden cost me nothing but time. And both of them made me happier than I had any right to expect. I received word, through Eleanor's office, that Garrett had sold his Seattle apartment and moved into a studio rental while he worked through his debt repayment. The gambling counseling he'd agreed to as part of a creditor settlement was, by all accounts, going better than expected. Dominic had closed his advisory practice and taken a position at a nonprofit financial literacy organization, Appropriate. I thought, in a dark sort of way. His restitution payments were arriving on schedule. I don't know if either of them is a better person now. I don't think that's mine to judge. I only know that the choices they made had consequences. And that their father, my husband, the man I loved for 17 years, had the patience and the love to make sure of it. Paul left me a final letter in the cedar box. Beneath the key and the envelope. I'd saved it for last. The way you save something you know will undo you. Renata. If you're reading this, then you've spoken to Eleanor and you understand what I've been doing this past year. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you while I was alive. I was afraid that if you knew, you'd ask me to be kinder to them. And I think you would have been right. Kindness is who you are. It's one of the 10,000 things I love about you. But kindness wasn't what this situation called for. What it called for was justice. And I was better positioned to provide that than you were, because I had the history. And the documents. And the particular advantage of being underestimated by my own sons. I want you to do one thing for me. Not with the money. Not with the house. Those are yours to manage however your heart tells you to. I want you to find something that is just yours. Not a legacy. Not a memorial. Something that makes you glad to be Renata. Without any other name attached to it. You spent too many years being patient and generous and self-effacing. And I love you for it. And I also know it wasn't always what you wanted. Now it's your turn. All my love, for whatever it's worth from here. Paul. I established the Gallagher Financial Safety Fund 8 months after Paul died. It provides legal support and emergency financial resources for women navigating financial abuse in family and estate contexts. It was Paul's idea. In a way, he'd left a note in the file about it, a passing suggestion that I might find the work meaningful. He knew me well enough to know that sitting still would be harder than fighting. He was right about that, too. I'm telling you this story not because I want you to be angry on my behalf, though I understand if you are. And not because I want you to admire what Paul arranged, though I find it difficult not to. I'm telling you this because for a long time, I believed that being treated as though I didn't matter was simply the price of belonging to that family. That 60 days and $250,000 and a condescending smile was what I was worth after 17 years. It took Paul dying to show me that it wasn't. It took a cedar box and a brass key and a woman named Eleanor Voss to show me that the people who said I didn't matter had been wrong about everything. And it took standing in a parking garage in Portland, Oregon, on a gray November afternoon, listening to the sound of my own footsteps, to understand what it felt like to be someone whose story wasn't over. Mine isn't over. Yours isn't either. Thank you for staying with me until the end. If this story moved you, if any part of it felt familiar, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what you would have done. Tell me your story, if you want to. I'll be here.